It's now time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. A full-fledged tug-of-war has begun over the minimum wage for next year in South Korea. Labour unions are calling for an increase of 18.9% due to the soaring rate of inflation, while the business community argues that the wage floor should be frozen as small shops and firms are simply unable to afford it. The country's minimum wage committee is set to resume discussions on Tuesday, as the deadline to decide the wage floor for next year is drawing closer and closer, with the final rate to be announced by early August. To discuss this highly contentious issue, we're joined by OH Kye-taik, Director of the Job and Wage Innovation Centre at Korea Labour Institute, and John Beirne, Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Very warm welcome to you both. And, well, my first question to you, Dr. Ho, on the situation that's ongoing in our country. South Korea's Federation of Korean Trade Unions and the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the country's largest two labour unions, they've been calling for a minimum wage of 10,891 per hour. And that is, of course, 18.9% higher than this year's. Do you think this level can actually be met?
I think it's probably not the case. It is the initial offer from the labor side. Usually, the initial offer from the both labor and management side are extreme. As we can see from the previous minimum wage bargaining process, both labor and management side provide the initial offers, and usually there's a big gap between these two offers. Both sides would negotiate the minimum wage level. However, it is really hard to get agreement from this negotiation because both labor and management sides know this kind of process, and they also know that they have to concede somewhat during the negotiation process. They tend to set their initial offer extreme as they concede somewhat from both sides. The gap between their offer would be decreased. If this gap can be managed to set the minimum wage of the next year, then they decide this level as the minimum wage. Otherwise, public members of the minimum wage committee would suggest the promotion session for deliberation of a minimum wage. After they try to get agreement within this range, it would be decided by agreement or voting of committee members. Therefore, I think the initial offer from Korean trade unions is less likely to be both their final offer and final decision.
Well, until that final decision is made, I suppose we can expect a lot of shouting matches, a lot of heated debates until they work out some concessions on both sides. And, well, Dr. Beirne, workers tend to think that the higher the minimum wage, the better, while the employers tend to think the opposite. They prefer a lower wage floor. But what is the right level? I mean, what factors should be considered?
Well, that's a very good question. I think on the worker side, of course, it's important to take into account what the real level of wage rise will be, not just the nominal. So that's why inflation is a very important concern in the current environment, and it's making negotiations very difficult. So at the end of the day, let's remember what the purpose of the minimum wage is. It's to increase the standard of living, and this is only done when the wage rise is in real terms. So also taking into account the general price level rises in the economy. And this outlook, of course, is very uncertain. On the employer side, of course, there's a preference to have a floor and a mitigated impact on their overall labor costs coming from minimum wage rises. So that's something that employers need to take into account in their negotiations. But on the other hand, there are also other factors to consider, such as the rises in morale, increased retention costs, and overall increase in productivity that could be yielded from increased minimum wages. But of course, it's important to reach the right level, and this is a very challenging environment to set that level given uncertainty with inflation. And it's even more important in the current environment, I would say, because developments in the labour market will actually determine whether inflation stays high at this level. And this is something that policymakers are paying close attention to at the moment.
And Dr. Oh, have higher minimum wages in South Korea, which soared over 40% during the past 5 years, generally led to more benefits or drawbacks?
I think there will be both benefit and drawbacks from the minimum wage policy. The most important benefit is to contribute to decrease the social inequality. Korea is one of the society in which there is a big gap between dual labor market, and then this kind of a labor market gap would lead to income inequality. Korea's income inequality would be generated from many factors, including firm size, employment type, and then the industry classification, and so on. One of the powerful ways to decrease income inequality is to increase a minimum wage level. There is some empirical finding that a relatively high level of the minimum wage increase of Korea nowadays decrease degree of income inequality in Korea. On the other hand, there is a drawback too. The most big drawback would be the negative impact on small and medium-sized companies and small business owners. Usually, small and medium-sized company and small business owners would have relatively low level of ability to pay. Therefore, if the minimum wage level is increased too much, then they would decide to decrease the employment or give up the business. This kind of phenomena would have a negative impact on employment of a Korean labor market as a whole.
But Dr. Beirne, we're hearing about the cost of living continuing to rise at just crazy levels all around the world. And is raising the minimum wage the best way to address the cost of living crisis?
It's a very good question. I think that raising the minimum wage is one of the ways, but if we think about the purpose of the measure itself, it's to essentially increase the standard of living for low-paid workers. And there are other measures which may be also important to take into account in this respect, such as, for example, tax credits on income, subsidies, transfer payments, and these types of measures arguably can be more important in an environment of uncertainty as regards the persistence of high inflation, which makes setting the minimum wage rise very difficult to ascertain. So I think that perhaps a combination of different factors should be taken into account in a period of uncertainty, certainly over the next year, and certainly actually till the end of this year and the start of 2023.
Well, Dr. Oh, Korean businesses, they tend to argue that the current minimum wage is 62% of the current median wage, making that figure one of the highest in the world. But does that make it sufficient, though, for the average Korean worker? I mean, how does South Korea's minimum wage compare to countries with similar socio-economic conditions?
I think the minimum wage level is relatively high compared to the other advanced countries. In terms of the minimum wage level, compared to the median wage, Korea ranks 8th among 30 OECD countries and the highest among G7 countries. The minimum wage level compared to the median wage level is used as a comparison of a minimum wage across countries because the absolute minimum wage level is hard to be compared across countries since each country has a different GDP and price level. Other countries like France is 60.9%, UK is 58.2%, Germany is 53.8%, Canada 48.3%, Japan 45.5%, and then USA is 28.3%. This is because of the relatively high level of minimum wage increase nowadays in Korea, which is 44.6% from 2016 to 2021. During the same period, the minimum wage level increase was 26.5% in Canada, 23.1% in UK, 13% in Japan, and 12 to 4% in Germany, and 6% in France. The market wage compared to the minimum wage is relatively high in other countries like Japan and USA. The minimum wage of Japan is about 9,030 yen. However, it is hard to employ workers less than 1,200 yen in Japan. Similarly, as long as my knowledge is concerned, the minimum wage of California of US is $14, but most of fast food restaurants suggest at least $17.
And Dr. Beirne, well, with energy and food costs on the rise, the lowest paid workers are under particular pressure. And how disproportionate is the impact of inflation on the lower paid households?
Yes, well, I think there are clear cross-country differences in the level of exposure of vulnerable groups to external price pressures. And this, of course, is the purpose for having measures in place to increase the standard of living of these types of low-paid workers. I think that in the near term, it will be a challenge to really impact upon the standard of living of these low-income groups, because, as stated earlier, inflation is a key concern. So even though nominal wage rises may be agreed, in real terms, the impact may be disproportionately lower. And this points towards additional measures which may help in the short term, such as, which I have reflected already, subsidies, transfer payments, and other types of tax credits which may be beneficial. That said, there are clear fiscal constraints at the moment coming out of the pandemic. So I think that there remains some challenges ahead for policymakers and all parties involved in these important discussions.
And well, this question goes to both of you, but let's begin with you first, Dr. O. In an age of income polarization, with IT moguls and big businesses really accumulating wealth, while the 99% really struggle to secure both current and future prospects, what should be the approach to setting the minimum wage?
I think it's quite tricky question. One of the positive effects of minimum wage is to diminish the wage polarization. Therefore, we need to consider many things in deciding minimum wage. We need to think about the price level of the national economy, the living standard of the workers, and then competitiveness of the company. This would be the tricky part of the minimum wage discussion, negotiation, and then decision. I think there is no better way than focusing on fundamental factors. We need to consider what would be the effect of a minimum wage on both workers and companies, and try to find the best or the second to the best way to reconcile these two factors. Another policy to consider is how to improve the competitiveness of the company. To improve competitiveness of the company, we can think about the workplace innovation, in which the working method is changed, and then the way of management of working is also changed. By changing both the working method and then the way of management, company would find other ways of business and then some better strategies. During this kind of innovation process, I hope firms might find a way to meet the minimum wage.
Well, Dr. Beirne, on one end, we're seeing highly paid workers at IT firms and corporate giants just making ridiculous, just astronomical sums of money, while on the other end of the spectrum, people can barely afford their next meal. How should the discussion on minimum wage change?
Well, I think that inflation and inflation uncertainty is going to play a key factor in the current discussions. To take the discussion a little bit deeper, it would be important to look at whether the target low-paid workers are really benefiting from this. Basically, it can be the case that those on minimum wages are not from low-income households. So a better targeting in the discussion may be helpful in the calibration. As well as that, on the employer side, I think that there are clear pressures on firm profitability and tight margins in particular sectors, which are even more apparent as we emerge from the pandemic. So this also needs to be taken into account when setting the appropriate rate, which would bring both parties together, whereby real wage rises would allow for additional disposable income, which can boost consumption and boost the economic outlook. While at the same time, it's important not to have this type of wage price spiral effect, whereby firms would actually be forced to increase their prices because the minimum wage rate rise may be set at too high a level. And this, of course, would create clear problems for policymakers in the longer term, and actually worsen the economic outlook.
Well, hopefully discussions on wage levels all over the world will lead to the gap really being narrowed between two very polarised ends of the spectrum. But this is where we must wrap up the interview today. That was OH Kye-taik, Director of Job and Wage Innovation Centre at Korea Labour Institute, and John Beirne, Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you both so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.